Hello, my name is Stephanie Dutan, and my presentation is on Oxford Street, which is located in Westminster, London, England, and was constructed from the years 1729 to 1890. This presentation will cover the political and social context of what was going on in the city and kingdom of the time, the architectural era during which the street was built, and how it could be seen in the buildings along the street, prominent surrounding architectural structures, and their presidents. This is a map of the United Kingdom at the time under which the Oxford Street was being constructed, and where the political name was actually Kingdom of Great Britain. Depicted during the time of Oxford Street's construction is a primary source map of Westminster, the borough of London in which the street is located. The organization of the city structure seems to follow an orthogonal grid that shapes the overall urban fabric, even though it appears to have very dense moments, especially along the Thames River. Now, speaking on what was taking place in the country a bit before the street's construction, starting off in 1714, under the Act of Settlement, George, Elector of Hanover, became king and demanded members of the monarchy to be Protestant and of the Hanover dynasty he was coming from. This led to two rebellions with Jacobites, which was a rival royal house for the House of Stuart, and would ultimately lead to victory for the British Army. By 1721, the British population doubled in size, going from 7.1 to 14.2 million people, and continued to gradually increase as advancing industrial and economic growth led Britain to become the first industrial nation in the world. This, however, led to many urban cities to become very densely populated and have poor sanitation systems. In terms of Britain acting as an imperial power, in 1783 it lost the 13 colonies of North America during the United States Revolutionary War, but subsequently acquired settlements in Africa, such as Sierra Leone, Trinidad, and Mauritius, which allowed them to strengthen their international naval dominance with overseas settler societies. This, as well as taking advantage of France's involvement in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, allowed Britain to forge a global empire that was at its peak from 1793 to 1815. Now, taking a look at what was going on in London specifically, we begin in the early 1700s, where London was the largest city in Europe with up to 600,000 inhabitants, and as was previously mentioned, will continue to grow in population exponentially. With that said, the first half of the 18th century included development of Mayfair as the quadrilateral bounded by Regent Street, Piccadilly, Park Lane, and Oxford Street. From 1717 to 1719, large estates were being developed, such as the Hanover Square that was built by Earl of Scarborough, and the lands that belonged to Lord Burlington and Sir Richard Grosvenor were being built as well. The Westminster Bridge opened in 1750, and from 1756 to 1757, construction of a new road from Paddington to Islington set a northern limit to the town's expansion for the rest of the century. A social issue that was taking place in the 1770s to 1780s was a huge gin drinking problem that both rich and poor fell victim to. By the late 1700s, Westminster streets became less squalid as the drinking problem decreased, and there was a betterment of the lower orders. And in the early 1800s, detached and semi-detached houses with private walled gardens and assistance to suburban growth were beginning to replace the uniform terraced rows. Now looking at Oxford Street, not much is known about the initial development and early appearance of the Oxford Street, besides the fact that it began as part of the Roman road from London to the west until the 1750s, where it had a range of names, including Tyburn, Uxbridge, Oxford, and Worcester, until in 1729 it finally adopted the name Oxford Street. Houses began to go up in the 1680s, and Rogue's map of 1747 shows both sides being built up as far west as Marylebone Lane. Construction continued to advance further west after 1764, as it was stimulated by developments such as the Portman Estate, situated north of the street, as well as distinct private houses like the Camelford House that was west of Marylebone Lane. In 1770, the St. Marylebone Paving Commissioners were put in charge of the maintenance of Oxford Street. This allowed them to pave the sector and equalize the high standard along the entire street. Development beginning from the frontage up until Park Lane was completed by 1780, and public executions that began in 1388 ceased. After Regent Street opened up, terraces were increasingly turned over into shops, which took place in the 1810s, with more ambitious architecture coming later on, which could be seen in 1865, for example with the rebuilding of Grosvenor's Estate's southern section, which was west of South Moulton Lane. In the late 1800s, Oxford Street gained its strength and fame with the rise of famous department stores on the north side, mostly west of the Oxford Circus. No new department store has been built since December in 1971, though medium-sized mixed shopping malls in new or converted buildings proliferated in the later 20th century. And this is just showing what the street looks like present day on the left and how it is situated in a more contemporary map on the right. During the 18th century, London was experiencing exponential population growth that was nearly twice the size as it grew from 575,000 people in 1700 to 675,000 people in 1750 to 900,000 by the end of the century. Yet there were far more deaths than births in the capital. The increase in numbers was entirely due to new arrivals from the outside. This led many of them to drift towards the suburbs, as they were in pursuit of the industrial jobs that were being introduced at the time in correlation to the development that was taking place. The financial means was present as well, as England at this time was economically prospering, with the American colonies subjecting to their power and sending their produce to the mother country for England to re-export and profit off of. All in all, what was left in suit was the doubling of traffic to take place in the city, a need for the grand population to produce/consume goods, and have offices and businesses to be employed in. Organizing a datum-like street such as Oxford Street was the perfect solution. It would create a safe and attractive urban public space that would attract increasingly mobile capital and organize a good portion of the city's underlying framework. Allowing the city to undertake this project would also be a means of the local authorities gaining legitimacy. Oxford Street can be described as a straight carriageway flanked by a wide footpath on both sides and where buildings maintain a consistent building line. Over 2 kilometers long, and its department stores sitting cheek by jowl with smaller buildings of every degree of pretension, a mixture that owes much of the fragmented freehold pattern. Leading due east from the Marble Arch is one of the chief approaches from the west end to the city, which are both marked on the map with blue circles. The street serves as essential access to the rectangular-like gridded urban fabric that organizes most of the West End of Westminster, as one can note from the perspective drawing depicted on the slide. It follows a uniform street-town planning device that accommodates for the larger parcels of land that transformed into elaborate estates and gardens. Examples of these include the Grosvenor Estate and Gardens, Hereford Gardens, and Portman Estate. The streets that run through this main avenue, such as Portman, Orchid, and Doon Street, for example, are arranged at right angles to Oxford Street, highlighted in yellow, while the island-like areas between the streets can be referred to as town blocks. Parts of the grid that were undeveloped town blocks took the form of gardens, as can be seen with some of the green squares shown on the map. On the street itself, one of the most prominent features is the Oxford Circus that takes place at the intersection with Regent Street. Now, during the 18th and early 19th centuries, London experienced exponential population growth and dramatic expansion. Simultaneously, a considerable number of uniform streets, landscaped squares, and tall red brick houses were made conspicuous, which in turn titled this period to be known as Georgian London. Inigo Jones was a key architect who introduced Italian Renaissance influences into the design of his uniform terrace housing blocks, for which is evident in a few buildings that run alongside Oxford Street. Such characteristics include semicircular arches to the ground floor level consisting of rusticated stonework, with the horizontal and vertical joint lines being exaggerated. A series of classical columns that stretched up to the roofline constituted the bays that divided the second and third floors. A singular rectangular window was placed between each column at the first and second floor levels, with those on the first floor being noticeably taller. The roofline was emphasized by a decorated band, or cornice, that was above the columns, as well as dormer windows that were to the attic floor. The sketch on the left is a relatively basic template that represents the concept Jones attempted to follow, while the image on the right shows the subtle resemblance of such characteristics in one of Oxford's buildings. As previously mentioned, Inigo Jones was a later participant of the Elizabethan era who began his career by designing costumes, set, and stage effects for royal masks, and yet still alluded to architectural concepts as he drew inspiration from Palladio's I Quarto Libro dell'Architettura and Vitruvian principles that emphasize symmetry. It was during this time period where he also placed great concentration on antiquity, which was also influenced by Italian architecture, in addition to previously mentioned principles as he was being commissioned by royals. An example of one of his earlier works include the Banqueting Hall, where he was commissioned by Lord Arundel himself to serve as the king's surveyor. Crucial ideas to this design included building a hall on the model of a Roman basilica, as well as implementing superimposed orders of columns, with the center of each facade being slightly advanced and crowned by a pediment. These ideas derived from Palladio's work, along with his incorporation of Vitruvian formulas and theories, but were still abstracted enough to begin to formulate a unique English character as Palladian's emphasis on making the main access out of the entrance's pediment center was being neglected. As previously mentioned, architecture from the Italian Renaissance era served as a tremendous influence on architect Inigo Jones, whose work in turn acted as an underlying foundation to the characteristics seen in the Georgian London architecture that characterized a majority of the buildings along Oxford Street. So in order to rightfully evaluate the work created in London during the Georgian era, one must analyze the preceding style established during the Italian Renaissance. To begin with, the overarching concept that defines this Italian era is bringing about a human scale into congruous form and mathematical proportion through architectural elements and antiquities commonly used in ancient Roman architecture. This would involve domes, columns, pilasters, etc., as well as classical orders. One of the most pivotal figures in this architectural style was Andrea Palladio, the chief architect of the Venetian Republic of the time, whose treatise I Quarto Libri dell'Architettura, which translates to 4 books on architecture, written in 1570, segued future architects to implement ideals covered in the literature, such as those of geometric form, absolute symmetry, and harmonic proportion in ordinary stately designs. This condensed medium of principles and concepts are what allowed architects like Inigo Jones to introduce it to places outside of Italy, such as England. Palladio felt that reason along with classical antiquities should be factors that dictate architectural designs. Such ideals are exemplified with the primary source of Palladio's plan of the Villa Rotonda from the book itself that shows a strong axial geometry equally proportioning off the vertical and horizontal components in a fluid manner. Seeing this in the plan allows one to easily see the correlations that relate and formulate the principal ideals for uniform terraced housing blocks. Now, speaking of uniform terrace housing blocks, one can define the term as a classical urban layout system of rows of regular square houses tightly bonded together with symmetrical facades to give off an illusion of unity. Its earliest tracings in England can be found in the Piazza Covent Garden, where Inigo Jones implemented new systems of the Italian Renaissance previously discussed to create facades that imitated that of Palladio's Grand Palazzo facades. This laid out the foundation for what would become London's most typical architectural style, which would soon see some alterations, but the idea of a palazzo-like facade imposing the glory of the king and nobility through congruent size and regularity remains strong in England. This can be seen in adaptable terrace forms that came about after the Covent Garden, such as with the Chester Terrace and Adelphi Terrace, for example. The smooth continuous surface of facing brick throughout the entire row that would be used later on during the 18th century, rather than utilizing the giant order Covent Gardens used, with a large order of columns with elaborate ornamentation that was placed on a high pedestal, is what isolated English terraces from Palladian characteristics. One of the terms briefly mentioned in the first Georgian architecture slide was a cornice, which is a decorative molding on a building's interior, although in this case it is a ledge on the exterior of a building. They generally serve for diminishing gaps or keeping rainwater away from the building's walls, which it still does for the Georgian buildings being discussed. However, these decorative bands also aided with emphasizing the ideas of Palladianism through the symmetrical proportionality and horizontal directionality it helped frame. By the time this architectural element was being utilized to ornate the exterior edges of roofs and windows and the typical uniform Georgian terraced house, the use of wooden cornices had been abandoned by law, and it was mandatory to make it out of either brick, stone, or stucco. Not only that, but it would have to be situated 4 inches away from the wall face. This is all due to the fact that people were fearful of fires potentially starting. Now, to continue with the progression of London Georgian architecture, house design continued to develop with architects like Peter Mills and Nicholas Barton, who slowly took away costly elements such as a stone facade to favor brickwork. as well as the Renaissance columns. However, the symmetry, spacing, and vertical proportions such components implemented was still maintained, as can be seen through the windows in the photo on the left. These ideas are highlighted in the with the 1774 Building Act being introduced, further renovation to Georgian house characteristics continued, such as buildings having 4 stories, parapets partly shielding the roof lines, and up and down sash windows replacing the older casement type. An example of this is seen in the right image that shows a building on the north side of Oxford Street, close to the intersection on Harnway Street. Basic construction of the houses consisted of brick walling, where a common feature was the rendering of the grounds level brickwork by stucco. This was often rusticated to stimulate stonework in an effort to enhance the entrance level. In terms of specific Georgian house features, windows in particular were always vertically proportioned in a way that related to the ceiling heights of the rooms they served. The ground and first floor windows were the highest, so they would have the longest windows, and the floors after that would have descending ceiling heights, therefore smaller windows, which echoed a hierarchical nature of the various floors. This example of a series of buildings shows how the example shown in the slide of a series of buildings shows how the windows decrease in size as you ascend in the building, as you progress higher up in the building. You could also tell a good number of the buildings that were on Oxford Street were second-rate or used to be second-rate homes, as the buildings shown in the picture, for example, were assigned 2 bays or windows per floor. Variations in the windows weren't unnormal, as there would be some cases where there would be curved bay windows, which can also be shown in the image, specifically under building 435. Doors of West End Georgian houses were had some of the most outstanding features, as there was a great variety, with one of the styles being similar to the doors displayed on this street front, with semicircular archways, an elaborate semicircular fanlight overhead, and narrow side windows on either side. Both these images show the variety of intricacies showcased in the door case. London Georgian architecture has been famed for the unified terraces or blocks that are characterized by being close in proximity and having equivalent elevations. This was a way to conform to the accepted taste in 18th century architecture and can be seen and implemented in buildings along Oxford Street, specifically with the 2 images on the left that show a series of buildings of all the same height. However, there was also a variation in heights among a lot of the buildings along Oxford Street as well, which is shown on the image on the right. And the image on the left, once again, shows all the elevations being the same. This inhibits the street to be solemnly viewed as a merged row along a unified streetscape. As many of the buildings transformed from residential to retail, modifications were made to the pre-existing buildings to transform many of them into storefronts. This was done by paving over the open front areas and widening the ground-level windows for display purposes, which were then framed with wooden uprights and crowned with a deep cross piece, also known as a fascia. Now, another prominent street in London that came after Oxford Street was Regent Street, designed by famed architect John Nash from 1809 to 1826. This unprecedented prod in metropolitan refinement came about through 2 coincidental occurrences that took place in 1811. The government claiming ownership of the 500-acre Marylebone estate that was previously owned privately, and the reign of the newly declared Prince Regent, who at the time saw potential in this sector's development and to being something extraordinary. Nash initially presented the plans in 1810 to the Department of Woods and Forests, which involved implementing a coherent, picturesque effect through terraces and crescents, as well as a double circus in the center. But at the same time, he wanted to make sure to acknowledge pre-existing buildings and making them visible. Nash took the widest street at the time, Portland Place, as inspiration for his idea to widen the cramped eastern portion all the way to Haymarket. This characteristic would provide greater attention and convenience, especially with a light colonnade that would project over ground floor shops and the mezzanine living quarters. This would provide a remarkable visual and architectural distinction between the floors that had unique programs. The overall purpose of incorporating it into the city fabric was to improve transit for the capital's increasing traffic. It was also meant to be a profit-producing, modernized north-south high road that conjoined fashion with commerce. Regent Street also served as a barrier between the slums of Soho to the east and the upper-class nobility further west. Regent can be described as an attractive, intentional performance space that included an eye-catching rounded corner and dome, a long colonnaded commercial frontage, and an additional scenic panorama for the street, with a slight bend just below Oxford Circus. It has two-way traffic that originated when coachmen would be instructed to enter with their horses from Piccadilly and then come down towards Oxford Circus. Its overall effect was meant to introduce a grid pattern that divided the West End into 6 major blocks and to line the Regency-style houses and buildings. This allowed it to play a significant part in what history would deem as the most ambitious, methodical renovation central London had ever experienced. Located on the intersection of Oxford Street and Regent Street, the purpose of Oxford Circus was to provide extra space that was needed for vehicles to maneuver around one another at either Oxford or Piccadilly Street junction. The concave frontages created as a result were also meant to entice shoppers and shopkeepers, therefore enhancing the value of Crown property. John Nash contrived the geometry of the Oxford Circus in a way that allowed for Regent Street and Oxford Street to intersect at nearly right angles and could act as a crucial node to both streets. The suggested circumnavigation is aided by the free circulation of air from the buildings that insinuate feelings of grandeur and space. Because the design took place early on in the Regent Street development, their architecture reflected a far more disciplined and less picturesque approach to street design. The circus contained 4 tight frontages of just over 60 feet each, and only 3 separate houses in each segment. This can be seen in the 5 bay elevations of the segments, which derive from the Palladian palazzo tradition, covering 4 main stories with hidden basements below, protected in the usual London manner by area railings. The ground area was reserved for shops and display windows. Above came a piano nobile, and the first floor fronted by iron balconies, then a lower second story which linked the two through pilaster strips, and then over the main cornice was a full but low attic story. The precedent to Oxford Street was St. George's Circus. When it comes to comparing the two circuses, both St. George's Circus and the Oxford Circus were utilized in conjunction with interconnecting streets to improve the circulation of transit. However, this Oxford Circus notably creates a 90-degree angle with the 2 streets that it intersects, while St. George's Circus has a single center line, that being Borough Street and various other streets intersecting the circus node in an almost organic manner that deals with misaligning diagonals. Also, St. George's Circus has a focal point of interest in the center of the circus, that being the obelisk, while Oxford Circus does not have any monument of interest at its center. Another monumental architectural feature along Oxford Street is the Marble Arch that was designed in 1825 to 1826 by John Nash as a ceremonial gateway to the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. It was removed in 1850 to be placed on Oxford Street, where it acted as an entrance to Hyde Park up until 1908, which is when park railings were installed. The Marble Arch is clad in white Carrara marble, the first such use for an entire British building. The three archways, flanked by monolithic Corinthian columns, declare its derivation from the Arch of Constantine, the richest of Roman triumphal arches, and the model for Persier's recent Arc du Carrousel in Paris not long before. It is also characterized by victories in two sizes in the spandrels and square panels of standing symbolic figures above the side arches. In the pedestrians' underworld around the island are mural mosaics by William Mitchell that were done in 1962. Now the precedence for the Marble Arch is the Arc du Carrousel. It was sponsored by infamous emperor and military leader Napoleon Bonaparte. The arc was under construction from the years 1806 to 1809 in Paris, France, and was commissioned under architect Pierre-François Léonard Fontaine. The director of the Napoleon Museum at the time, Dominique Vivant-Denon, worked alongside Fontaine to develop the monument's sculpted ornamentation, for which is characterized by the Corinthian order of architecture that could be seen in the Marble Arch as well. And just like how the Marble Arch acted as a gateway to Oxford Street, the Arc du Carrousel shares a similar function, as it also acts as a monumental entrance to the Tuileries Gardens of the imperial residence, which simultaneously acted as a major western axis for Paris. Between the white statuary marble and colored marbles utilized to enhance specific sculpturing and bronze figures, Dutan made sure to utilize a diverse range of materials to emphasize the arch's richness and splendor. This in turn also aided in exemplifying the purpose of the arch itself, which was to extol the political regime at the time. With the mighty emperor and military being able that were running at the time, and just evoke a sense of pride in the triumphant military campaigns. Now, seeing that John Nash played a huge role in developing crucial components of London's urban fabric during this time period, that being the Regent Street and Oxford Street, as previously mentioned, it is important to look at the events that led him to this monumental time in his career. Nash began his architectural career with the opening of his own firm in Wales in 1789, after previously going through economic and personal hardships in London. After acquiring local fame through the building of gauls at Carmarthen and Cardigan, Nash maintained connections in Wales, but slowly began to do more works in London that were primarily estate buildings, rebuildings, and extensions to pre-existing houses. It was during this time one would associate him with being a country house architect, as villas, castles, and grand country houses were being created in this period. It was in 1811 when Nash was commissioned to be the new Prince Regent's architectural and sometimes political confidential advisor, after submitting original residential plans for the development of Marylebone Park, and began his involvement in metropolitan improvement projects. This would include work such as the Marylebone Park and Quadrant, Windsor Castle, and Buckingham Palace. And these are key terms that I used during the presentation, and this is my bibliography. Thank you so much.